Good afternoon and good morning to those who are watching on the West Coast, and welcome to This is Revolution podcast. I am your normal co-host, Pascal Robert. Our normal host, Jason Miles, is in transit right now, but I have found out he has arrived at his destination in the Bay Area, and he's taking some time off to spend some time with his lovely family and his son, Phoenix. So I will be marshaling the show today, and my co-host for the today is a friend of show, always ready to help us with analysis of things domestic and foreign. Our great comrade Stefan Veteran Lee, also known as Thor Guevara.
Hey man, for the chat, I'm producing today, so if everything fucks up, don't blame Pascal, blame me.
That's right. Stefan is handling the tech side. He is the producer that we have. This is our normal Saturday show. Marcus, who was our man in Virginia, who used to be our man in Maine, just texted me, and he should be coming on hopefully in 10 minutes. But before that, Stefan, how you doing in across the pond, mate?
Yeah, I'm doing all right. You might be able to tell. For once, I've got actual natural lighting. My window's open. The lighting looked good, so I'm out here in the sun.
Well, that's all right, man. Maybe you can get some vitamin D and get some suntan. But before we, continue any further, I think that we should introduce our guest and discuss what our subject today is. Today, we're going to be talking about the subject of hyperpolitics and postpolitics and what exactly those terms mean, with the author of an article that was in Jacobin, which is paywall, but you can also find the article and other sources.
Tribune.
Yes, the Tribune is a good place to find the article as well. From Postpolitics to Hyperpolitics by Anton Jäger, who is a friend of Stefan. Great article. Anton is a PhD candidate at Cambridge who specializes in the populist era and movement. Anton, welcome to This is Revolution podcast. I
Glad to be
really
here.
interested in having this conversation with you. I read your piece and I found it fascinating. I want to ask you one question, not totally related to your article. I know you are a scholar of populism in America and the West. Do you happen to study the populist era of the 19th century in the U.S.?
Absolutely. That's actually my central area of expertise. So my
I'm
PhD.
so glad you said that because I'm a bit of a fanatic stan of the populist era of the 19th century. I have several books. I'm sure maybe you've heard of the Colored Farmers Alliance.
Of course. Yeah.
Yes. I purport that it's probably one of the most radical and transformative movements in the history of Black America that no one knows about.
Definitely. It's a hugely understudied topic, but it was very, very consequential at the time.
I know about it from alternative history map games.
Well,
yeah.
You know what, Anton? We're going to get to your article, but I promise you, we're going to make you and solicit you for an offer to come on the show to talk about the 19th century populist era in detail for us.
I'd love to, because I'm currently turning the PhD into a book, which is supposed to be a sort of new history of the American populist movement.
I was going to say also today's a very good time because Anton just posted the first episode of his podcast today.
Yes, yeah. Our weekly Zoom rant. We're turning our Zoom meetings into recordings.
Which is excellent, very wonderful. So, Anton, I just want to let you know that just based on your area of study, you've already captured my interest before we even got into your article. And here's Marcus. But Stefan, do we have the Tribune link to Anton's article that we can share with the audience?
Yes, probably. Yeah.
So, Anton, if you can, for us, let's do what we like to do here on This is Revolution and set the terms of engagement, if we can. Explain to us your definitions of the phenomenon hyperpolitics and postpolitics.
Yeah, it's a tough question, which shouldn't be a tough question because I wrote a damn article about it. So, but it's proven quite difficult to define in a very succinct manner. I always do it with a contrast, insofar as hyperpolitics can only be understood in contrast to postpolitics, which I think is a predicament that arose after the triumph of neoliberalism in the 1880s and the 1980s and the 1990s, and which basically foreshortened or abolished what we could call a collective deliberation of needs at the heart of our society. So how society distributes its surplus, how we organize our interaction with nature, which I think is a central question of politics as such. That question was basically suspended and was delegated to individual consumer choice. So it was no longer a collective matter, while at the same time, the encasing of that individual consumer choice was provided by technocrats. So I'd say it's not just the end of history, but it's also the end of politics, insofar as people don't actually deliberate on what they want to do with society's resources. And this means there's a sort of privatization of the political, in which people are not longer part of civic organizations. They don't really want to talk about who they're voting for. Politics becomes a purely private matter that you don't really discuss publicly. And it becomes a terrain for junkies at the same time, insofar as to be into politics is almost like a hobby. It's not that people are naturally political or that they're born in a Christian or a socialist or any ideological family. It's just that politics is something you decide to be into, or you have to actively encourage yourself to be into it. Rather than something...
We're seeing kind of the hobbyization of kind of war and war following in recent days.
Yeah, it's a good analogy in that way. And what we see now, at least in the 2010s, is that 1990s predicament of post-politics, in which there is a very strict separation between the public and the private, and there's no collective deliberation on needs and what we do with society's resources, has clearly ended. And politics now penetrates the private sphere, whether it's through debates about wokeness, whether it's through debates about identity, etc., to an extent which was unimaginable 30 years ago. But at the same time, it doesn't look anything remotely like the mass politics we knew from the 20th century. And this is this predicament I call hyperpolitics, where post-politics ends, but the classical form of politics we knew from the 20th century doesn't return. And we end up with a very weird hybrid we can't actually make sense of. Hyperpolitics is my conceptual attempt to make sense of this new situation.
Excellent. Thank you so much for laying the groundwork. I want to tell you, I found your article fascinating in that I agree with your framing of the phenomenon, but I think my calendar of the actual events is a little bit more elongated than you. In that, in layman's terms, what you're basically saying is that after the fall of the Soviet Union and with the rise of the consensus of neoliberal capitalism in the 90s, with the kind of duopoly of Clintonism in America and Blairism in Britain, the need to believe that mass politics challenging capital and empire, because there was an illusion that we were in a time of peace, because we hadn't had a major war since Vietnam, even though we did have the crisis in the Balkans. No one really considered that a major conflagration, excuse me, if you will. We entered a sense of quote-unquote post-politics. In other words, we were beyond the era of the New Left, of the 60s, where everyone was mobilized into protesting something. People were challenging something. And that we were in a period where there was no longer contestation. So if I'm correct, that's how you're defining the period of post-politics, correct?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Although I'd be careful to say there was no consultation at all, insofar as you did have the GA protests. There were alter-globalization movements which tried to pose their own challenge to this new capitalist order. But that happened in a sphere of marginality, where it was very much happening at the margins, which itself testifies to that post-political predicament. So even the modes of contestation, that existed in that post-political era are themselves deeply anti-political products.
My slight, I wouldn't say disagreement with you, or maybe I'm willing to be proven wrong. I would argue that the period of post-politics starts earlier than that, and starts with the move into neoliberalism in the 70s, the fall away from the Bretton Woods agreement, and the changing of American capitalism, maybe post-Nixon. I would say with the rise of maybe Carter, we start to move into a kind of post-politics era, because my argument is that the capitalist consensus of the ruling class starts before the 90s. I would argue it starts in the late 70s. And a good book on that I've mentioned several times on the show, which I'm still reading, is Judith Stein's Pivotal Decade, which is about the 70s as well. So I very much agree with your post-politics theory, but I would actually make the argument that the period upon which it begins probably starts with the neoliberal consensus in the late 70s. And I would argue that evidence of that in the 80s is that with the rise of the reactionary right in America, with the birth of Reaganism, there was not a lot of mass mobilization on a real serious scale to the Reagan-Thatcher phenomenon at all. I would argue that in the terms of the context of traditional American political and Western political history, that was a rather apolitical era.
I mean, that's definitely not true in the UK, though.
Yeah, in the UK, it doesn't really hold. So I think you're very right to locate the point of departure for post-politics in the US a bit earlier, but the 1980s were an intense period of social strife and struggle in the UK. So if you look at the miners' strike,
I will concede to you guys, my expertise is much more limited in the UK underground politics. So I will concede it. But I think in America, I love your framing. I think it's phenomenal. But I would extend it a little back to starting to the late 70s and going into the 80s as well. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I would agree with it. I think we can reach a sort of meeting point where I'm willing to concede that the phenomenon I'm describing comes into its own in the 1990s and the 2000s. Like, it achieves a degree of stability and hegemony it didn't quite have before. But in the 1970s, 1980s, and certainly as Judith describes in Pivotal Decade, or even in Still Running America, there are really signs that our collective deliberation of needs, or politics, is proving so difficult for American capital to accept. Like, they want a total prerogative over investment. They want to have a total say about what happens with society's resources, that they push for this post-political consensus already in the 1970s. So it's only that in the 1980s that it's victorious, or that it achieves a degree of stability it didn't have before.
So on that basis, where do you think the kind of transition to hyperpolitics begins? Like 2008 with Obama, or something like this? Or
that's a good question. I don't think I'm comfortable demarcating it that explicitly in 1 year, but I think we definitely need to see it in the context of post-2008. In that 2008 is the big bang of this hyperpolitical era. It's just that the fallout becomes visible. Yeah, fallout becomes visible with a lag. So you could say that 2016 was this sort of populist year insofar as Trump and both Brexit happened. I don't think that's a particularly interesting framing, because it seems as if the world was just doing fine before 2016. But I think post-2008 is a pretty, serviceable framing for what we're talking about.
Well, listen, I if you guys don't mind, and I will, surrender to the will of majority. Can we bifurcate the discourse? Let's talk about post-politics, its ramifications, and then we'll do a deep dish dive into hyperpolitics and its ramifications. Is everybody okay with that? Or do you want to?
I mean, I agree, and which is that
you've talked about post-politics before, right, Pascal?
I think we. Well, the thing is, though, post-politics.
Let's do it again. We've got plenty of time.
Post-politics is kind of a perennial theme of our show, the 50-year counter-revolution, if you will, or the 50-plus year counter-revolution. And Anton, if you're not familiar, our basic position on the show is that from 1968 forward, basically American politics, we could argue Western politics overall, but definitely American politics, is a counter-revolution against the New Left and the New Deal Civil Rights Coalition of the 1960s, and that most of our framing of politics is an attempt to be a corrective against that particular period. I think as a scholar of political history as you are, we can make the argument that the rise of Brzezinski-esque trilateralism is a product of a reaction to the 60s, if you will. We definitely know with Reaganism that's definitely part of reaction. So our theory on the 50+ year counter-revolution is that all of American, I would say maybe Western, but I really definitely American. I'm more confident saying that American politics in the post-68 period is kind of a counter-revolution against the New Deal civil rights era. And one of the reasons why I love your framing is that it gives a very nuanced breakdown of the evolution of the politics in that era. And I don't want you to, I'm not blowing smoke at you. I really love the way you frame the period in your show. And the only reason why I want to focus on post-politics, right, is that there's a period of transition that it's very easy. This is shocking for me to say. It's so easy to skip over today, but it seemed like it lasted forever when it was happening. 9/11 and the war on terror. It's like no one even remembers the quagmire of global geopolitics during that period of time and how traumatized the world was. And in the context of where we are today, even before the crisis in Ukraine, people just like bypass like what 9/11 and the war on terror meant. How would you categorize the Bush administration? And I know Blair was still kind of like on his tail end. The 9/11 war on terror period. How does that fit into your paradigm?
Yeah, I think one way of periodizing it is that you have the post-history of the 1990s, where Fukuyama as a prophet declares the ultimate victory of liberal democracy. And then you have a sort of buoyant or triumphant era of post-history and post-politics. And then you also have a paranoid or anxious period of post-politics, which is mainly the 2000s. So the 1990s still had that sort of euphoric feeling that if everyone would just join in this global civil society, shorted by the market, peace between nations and between individuals was imminent. The Yugoslavian wars, of course, already threw that into sharp relief. It's just in 2000 that it's clear that that utopia is completely untenable, or it becomes a paranoid utopia. But it's not as if any concrete alternative to it arises. And one of the interesting things with the marches against the Iraq War, which were still some of the biggest marches that were ever held in certain countries, I think only the BLM marches of the last year, but not the year before, were actually bigger. But they pay testimony to a mode of protest and a mode of contestation that is numerically very impressive. You can rally a lot of people, but the organizational legacy, except for some coalitions, was quite weak. So if you compare that to anti-Vietnam protests in the 1960s and 1970s, it's just very clear that also, as with the civil rights movement, people would join these protests as members of already established civil society. So you come as a delegate to the NAACP or from a union, or for example, with Bayard Rustin as a labor organizer. And that means that they're not just random gatherings of individuals, they're organizational meetings where several organizations rally their members. While in the 2000s with the Iraq War protest, and I think this has become even more explicit with the BLM protest, they're just random gatherings of people who don't have an organizational affiliation, who are not there in the name of a certain institution, but who just join because they agree morally with the cause of that protest. And this is obviously not a condemnation of it, but it pays testimony to a specific form of contestation, which is very limited, and which I think also encapsulates the post-political era, or its strength, very well.
To Stefan, I'm sure if you don't mind, Stefan, you want to jump in with some thoughts or questions?
No, you were just muted for a second, so I started panicking as if I'd done something, but no, it was just a glitch.
Okay, no, that was me. I muted myself. Marcus, you have anything you want to add?
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I guess if maybe Anton can start laying out like where the foundations of HyperPolitics start coming into.
We're gonna get there.
Okay. Because I feel like, I don't know. I feel like we have a good understanding.
HyperPolitics is probably going to cover the rest of the show. But I got a theory that I want to pose to Anton.
Okay.
It's an important topic because you can only understand HyperPolitics in contrast. So we need to get post-politics down first.
Right.
Okay.
Anton, I got an 800-pound gorilla in the room for you. All right. So I want you to take this on. I would argue that one of the reasons why mass mobilization and mass politics, in other words, movements, protests, etc., in the in the post-politics era and even the hyper-politics era become ineffective is because they are not transpiring in the context of a counter-hegemonic threat to American capitalism, i.e. a Soviet Union. Meaning that I would contend that the threat to American capital and capital hegemon that existed during the New Left period of the 60s, even to the Old Left of the 30s, that forced concessions by the ruling class, particularly in America, does not happen without the threat of a global counter-hegemon, and that global counter-hegemon being the Soviet Union. And I contend that one of the reasons why left mass politics fails from post-politics to hyper-politics is because there is no serious left counter-hegemon. I'd like your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'd definitely say it's one of the factors that contributed to it. I would be careful describing it, as they say, monocausally, and saying that purely the disappearance of the Soviet Union disables or enables the entry of post-politics. I think there were processes internal to the US, but also to Europe, which also contributed to it, which were quite separate from the dissolution of the Soviet bloc. But you can even see that in the 1990s, after Dengism, even the other poles of geopolitics in China completely start to shift. And even there, you have talk of the end of revolution, a market revolution, now organized by the Communist Party. So the disappearance of the Soviet bloc not only pushes this mass labor reserve onto the global labor market, which makes possible a new era of capitalist modernization, but it does completely shift the ideological terrain insofar as anyone who's even remotely on the left and who's even anti-Soviet is affected by the dissolution of the Soviet bloc, because it represents the concrete practical instantiation of a certain doctrine. So even Trotskyists who are anti-USSR, like Ernest Mandel, who was a very famous Belgian Trotskyist, experienced 1989 or 1991 specifically in Russia as a trauma, because their critical object has now disappeared. So this is this fascinating thing that even as a Trotskyist who was always opposed to USSR, you should actually rejoice the disappearance of this Stalinist monolith. But clearly it doesn't, because the idea was if it's a degenerated worker state, then you need to have a revolution internal to that worker state and keep some of the infrastructure of socialism. But that doesn't happen, of course, because Russia just becomes a kleptocracy in the 1990s. And that's hugely confusing for all kinds of tendencies which are anti-Soviet. And I think most crucially, the disappearance of the Soviet bloc kills off most of the strongest European communist parties in Italy, in France, certainly in the UK. And that is also a danger for the ruling class, because they now don't have opponents anymore that can actually discipline them. So that means that no one is actually telling you that you're making mistakes, and it means for a much sloppier and messier form of rule than anything.
Have you guys seen like several articles being put out in US mainstream media about tankies this week?
Yeah,
yes,
interesting.
And you know they can't name an organization they're targeting here. I'm not sure. I guess some of them name Twitter accounts, and some of them just name no one at all. It's purely ephemeral. But yeah, it shows exactly what Anton's saying.
It's this deeply Freudian need to retrieve an enemy that could actually hold you to account in a certain sense and make sure that you become a disciplined ruler. But since those countervailing powers have completely disappeared, you have to resuscitate them in an imaginary way just to make sure that you still have an enemy you can actually face in this situation.
And when it comes to like U.S. politics, you see like even there's the point of post-politics when it comes to this the two-party system, but like there's no ideological difference between Republicans and Democrats. And I mean, for decades, just being the opposition is a form of politics, just being the existing, other side. And that's, and like, I think that's been hammered hard lately, but it's essentially, been the narrative for my entire life. So, yeah, I guess I don't know if you want to expand on that as far as, how these things can overlap into the United States and our political systems, or, if that's just a...
Yeah, the US is a weird case, if I understood your question correctly, also because the US never had mass parties in that European sense. That is another of these American exceptionalisms, which partly has to do with the early arrival of at least full male suffrage in the 19th century, where the way Europe got its political parties is they were basically suffrage agitation machines. So they were put into place to grant people the vote, and this means that parties have to be these really densely organized, coherent units that want to force capitalists and the aristocracy to give votes to the working class.
Well, US parties started like out as machines, right?
Yeah. Yes. In the US, they're more like clientelistic rackets almost, which try to capture the state apparatus with the spoil system.
They're birthed as tools of the bourgeoisie from the beginning.
Yeah. And they, very early on in the late 19th century, and certainly after the populist threat in the 1890s, which is one of the last times that this two-party duopoly was existentially threatened, I'd say. They basically
fused the people in the back, Anton. Say it again for the people in the back.
Yeah, it's true. It's one of the last serious challenges to bipartisanism in the US, but it means that the parties basically make it impossible for third parties to even enter the electoral field through the mechanism of primaries, and they basically fuse with the state. They become state departments. So I think people really need to understand that American parties are basically like state departments. They fuse with the state to such an extent. And that doesn't mean you have to call the US totalitarian, but it is in many ways like a party dictatorship insofar as the parties inhabit the state to an extent which is completely unimaginable in Europe. But one thing I'd say, sorry,
the US also because the country's so partisan that neither party either loses like 100% of its seats. And so you can always be you'll always have this flow of money and positions and whatever, because in some places the other party will never win regardless of what you do.
So your capture of the state is much stronger. There is no tradition of political compromise as well, as you also have in some of these European democracies. But I will add one important point. What happens in the 1980s and 1990s in the constellation of American politics, which is different from what came before, is that even though the US never had mass parties, the parties in the US were still connected through a densely organized civil society. So even if they don't have a mass base, they at least have these satellites which provide them with a substitute mass base. So you see this with the Democratic Party, who has to pay attention to what unions think, who has to pay attention to what certain Black organizations think. You see this with the Republicans as well, who have this massive constituency that is quite densely organized that forces them to do certain things. And I think in the 1980s and 1990s, certainly after the victory of Reaganism, this civil society disappears on both sides. So unions go into decline, all these mass membership or civic organizations become NGOs and become elite organizations. You see this very clearly with certain ethnic brokerage groups as well. And this means that the story that plays out in Europe, where the mass parties decline, has a weird counterpart in the US as well, is that the underlying substructure of the parties also desiccates and disappears. So they just float in the void without any satellites within society itself. And the Democratic Party can just govern on its own without any pressure from social groups that might force them to do certain things.
Do you think that the Democratic Party is actually a party of containment as opposed to opposition? Or in other words, I posit that the function of the Democratic Party is to neutralize oppositional politics under the guise of ideological control and coalesce with the right around consensus of policy. In other words, they perceive themselves and project an illusion and a charade of more progressive than in order to capture all of the progressive energy or left energy or socialist, if you will, into their electoral voting apparatus, not to pay attention to the demands of those forces that are to their left, but to actually neutralize them intentionally and then coalesce with the reactionary right. Do you think that is a ideological structural intention or just simply a realpolitik?
Really good question. It's a very tough question as well. I think some people in the chat are talking about the Democratic Party as a controlled opposition. That is an attractive phrase, but I don't think it's fully accurate insofar as control seems to imply that they're purely subdued by the Republicans and that they don't actually want to pursue these policies themselves. So there's this constant refrain you hear from certain Democratic politicians, whether it's about the filibuster or Manchin, that they won't actually let us have nice things. We want to do all these really ambitious things, but sadly, the opponents can't do them. I think the big mistake or the illusion that, at least on the left, I don't think the left is that gullible, but other people make about the Democratic Party is that the Democratic is not just like ideologically hostile, it's like constitutively hostile to social democratic politics, and certainly in the last 40 years. So it's not just a controlled opposition, it's a loyal opposition that serves to, it just represents one faction of American capital. And it tries to reconcile the interests of that faction of American capital with the electoral base they also need to marshal to stay into government. So they have this deal between ethnic brokerage politics, where they rely on, I wouldn't say buying votes, but basically having talking points that could get you a constituency that's big enough to keep you in office, while at the same time...
we call them fat back and biscuits. Patronage.
Yeah, I mean, Adolf Reed discusses this very well in many of his books as well, is that there is a specific American patronage system that doesn't look like the Jacksonian era or the Gilded Age anymore, but which is still about just giving spoils to certain of your constituencies, while at the same time making sure that any of the demands that constituency can make do not conflict with the interests of the faction of capital you represent. And the Republican Party represents a different faction of capital and a different popular constituency that has certain demands. So it's not controlled opposition, it's just loyal opposition insofar as both want to support their faction of capital and they want to make sure that they evade conflict between that faction and their popular voting base.
One of the concepts that we've popularized in my writing and we talk about on the show is the left flank of capital and the right flank of capital, and that we are dealing with the left flank of capital, which is not just the Democratic Party, the nonprofits, the philanthropic world, the academic infrastructure, the left media ecosystem, all represent the left flank of capital. And just because it's the left flank of capital doesn't mean that it does not work as an echo chamber for the interests of capital.
No, definitely. It has some relative autonomy, as they say. So it can make decisions for capital insofar as capital doesn't have a preconceived notion of its interest. Like parties do articulate what capital's interests are in that sense. I'd be careful just calling the left flank of capital insofar as, is the Democratic Party really on the left? And certainly compared to...
Say it again. This is
I mean,
you're gonna become a new friend of the show.
I think where when it comes to that though, like where the most important thing is like where's the overlap between the left and right flank, you know, and like it's not over anything that's even close to ideologically left at all, right? And like in military spending is probably one of the number one things when it comes to, we have no problem increasing the military budget, and that's where like that's just a large right flank that gives out some grants to like the Sierra Club.
I heard the US is going up to 800 million on the defense budget, 800 billion, sorry. So I think
it's going up.
And this is before 2025.
That's MMT. Yes. That's MMT in action.
Yes, indeed. Right. We can do it all. When it comes to the defense budget, like, I mean, like real dollars, we're at $1 trillion. The budget for this year will be over $1 trillion. Like, and that's, hey, this, I guess, yeah, where you say that there's no real like left and right flank. It's just where the overlap is at the worst part of capital.
It's a jobs program for Northern Virginia as well. Like Northern Virginia needs jobs.
Raytheon Acres.
Exactly. How are you going to get these people jobs if you don't spend $1 trillion on defense?
Well, to my larger point, though, I think you would agree that this is not just something that we're stumbling on. This is an intentional utility of the liberal or the left flank of capital. And I appreciate your challenge by saying, why call it left? Is there anything left about it? It's a fair characterization. I would say left in that it is left of the reactionary right in that regard.
Yeah, definitely further left.
This is something that I didn't start thinking about really until the millennium with the rise of Obama. Do you believe that the liberals or the left flank of capital, with the rise of Clintonism and the rise of Obama, have not only auditioned to become, but have effectively become the more preferable stewards of finance capital?
I think it's even stronger than that. They've not just become the preferable stewards of finance capital, but of capital as such. And I think the Trump years make this very clear, is that American capital, when it manages to unite itself, because American capital is uniquely under-organized compared to European capitalist classes, because European capitalist classes faced much mightier opposition. And if you face mightier worker opposition, you have to associate into institutions what makes certain forms of collective bargaining possible. In the US, because it's such a big country with such a weak historical labor movement, capital never felt the pressure to organize and is uniquely splintered and almost insular, where there's loads of factions and they don't agree on many things. What they do agree on is that they need wage laborers to get surplus value for them, of course. That is the only point of consensus they can reach. But at the same time, I think, yes, the Democratic Party successfully auditioned in the 1990s and 2000s to become a better caretaker for some factions of American capital, which are the most powerful ones. And the Republican Party is actually becoming worse and worse at that role, because it has this really boisterous, chaotic constituency that is constantly making demands, like, for example, shutting down the government. Like, there's tiny factions of American capital would like the American government to shut down. But the actual big American capitalists don't want any of this nonsense. And you see it very clearly on January 6th with this Trumpite storming of the Capitol, is that American corporations were unanimous in their condemnation of this approach. So it throws the idea of an impending fascism in the US into sharp relief, because fascism, at least in all the classical Italian and German scenarios, requires a significant section of the capitalist class to rally to these anti-democratic or anti-Republican forces. And what you saw at January 6th afterwards is universal condemnation on behalf of the American capitalist class of this lunacy, and a real desire to get the Democrat in so that actual normal service could be resumed. So yes, I think the Democratic Party has become more successful. There is an issue, though, that it can't actually always cater to the demands of its more left-wing base at this point, precisely because the fallout of 2008 hit all these groups differently.
Fascinating. Stefan, you want to jump in? You have any comments or thoughts?
No, I mean, I've just been keeping all the hyperpolitics questions in my head.
I mean, go ahead, Marcus. You want to jump in?
Well, I get, and just kind of makes me think about like how this is like seen in real time, and it gets to like real people's lives. Because you make a really good point too of like, there's the Democratic Party or like Democratic officials, like they don't get like a fax every morning, drinking their fucking coffee and say, these are the ways that I help capital today. These come from institutions that seem to represent people's interests, and like those institutions are largely filled up by retired folks who have enough money to actually like be retired, and this is where you get into like, whether it's the Sierra Club or some Italian Heritage Foundation, like these are the groups that are actually like organizing to talk to these like officials, and like they're a lot of these demands can be given without question. A lot of these demands do not threaten capital, whatever. Hey, we want this street named after X person, or this certain roads need to be widened, or like they're not really getting any of the road, like the roots of these problems. But there's this like just illusion that, oh hey, yes, there's the Sierra Club's attached to the Democratic Party, so they must care about the environment, when like, and then you see where's the overlap with capital and the Democratic Party, and like oil and gas industries, the military industrial complex. That's one of the driving factors of global warming. Like, we will go to town as far as that spending, and it's just a very raw, fake form of politics. I mean, which is saying that's post-politics, yeah.
Anton, I want to tell you, and I'm not trying to be overly flattering here. As a student of political history in Europe, in Britain, I want to tell you right now, your clarity and conciseness in understanding American political development is better than a lot of American academics we have in this country.
Thank you. I am flattered. That's a very, very good compliment.
Anton's been raised like slightly off the floor by being compared favorably to most American academics. So he's somewhere still below a dog, but you know.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a low bar. But I can make it.
By the way, is that internationally recognized that the American academics are pretty much a low, ain't all
Well,
that?
I think it's just because the US is kind of the most ideological place because it's the center of this stuff, right? I think the Americans firmly believe their own bullshit.
Yeah, and have you ever spent 5 minutes on Twitter? I think you can see just how present they are in that space.
Now, are we getting into HyperPolitics now? If we're talking about Twitter, like, are we getting?
I think American academics also.
I think we're 41 minutes in. Let's make the pivot. Let's talk about the rise. And I'm sorry if you guys felt I prolonged the post-politics era too much.
I think we understand what it is, and it's good for the, if as much as we can just explain the points. But I like when I think Stefan and I had no questions, is because like we get it, and so.
First question I'd like to have out the gate. Give us a little recap of hyperpolitics, and when does hyperpolitics start? Does it start with the Obama phenomenon, and is the Obama candidacy a distinct aberration in presidential campaigning that can be considered as the window to hyperpolitics? I ask this question for one reason. There are some of at least the Black hyperpolitics actors that I know, Black Lives Matter activists, dream defenders, so on and so forth, who start to take life in the teens of the aughts, 2014, 15, that come out of the Obama campaign. Literally. They were, campaign activists and actors who became frustrated with Obama and basically developed these identitarian movements. So I want to really get your thoughts on whether or not, and you can disagree. I consider you more expert than I am by far. Does 2008, the crash definitely, obviously, but Obama as well, represent the window to the new hyperpolitics?
I think the expression of a window is a great one. So I'm not willing to posit a strict cutting off point when post-politics ends and hyperpolitics begins. I think that's impossible to periodize. I think it's a gradual process that runs at different speeds. I think the so-called populist era of the 2010s is an acceleration. It's only post-COVID, I think in 2020 and 2021, that you really see all around you that a certain post-political era has ended. So there's lag, there's always a certain delay in some of these processes, but if you just compare the situation to that of 20 years before, the field looks completely different. And the question becomes, what has happened in the intermittent time? I think the Obama era is an interesting prefiguration, or I'd also say window of our hyperpolitical era. Because partly, American presidential elections are always these very weird cyclical moments where there's intense mobilization and suddenly everything becomes refigured in terms of them. But then in the intermittent 4 years, either also with the midterms, not actually that much happened. But there was this idea mainly that Obama presented this post-racial moment, but at the same time, so much of the actual campaign was symbolic. They had something affirmative about it, insofar as it was not about the specific policies he was going to pursue, even though there were vague promises around Medicare for all, et cetera, or better American system. It was more saying, like, if we elect this person, we'll reach a moral benchmark, which is incredibly significant, which we have to agree is incredibly significant. Like, you can't just minimize or diminish the symbolic value of the Obama election. But in policy terms, it was so vague and abstract.
It literally said hope.
Yeah.
Like, I look back on that and like, I'm amazing. Amazing to be able to do that.
It's really impressive. Yeah, and you just need to read Adolf Reed, who already noticed this about Obama in the 1990s. It's like, it's not just form over content, it's a sort of perfection of form, which never is forced to talk about content. What happens in the 2010s, partly with the fallout of 2008, is that there's this post-racial promise in Obama that's obviously not borne out because his policy.
Say it again.
Yeah,
say it again for the people.
Racial stratification continues in the 2010s, and Obama leaves the Democratic Party in a really, really messy state. So although he's a very popular president, the Democratic Party really suffers as a party under his tenure. And this, of course, creates the opening for radicalization of the symbolism you already saw during the Obama campaign, which is, well, the post-racial moment hasn't actually come. Police are still killing Black teenagers under a Black president. What does this actually mean? And of course, then you see how the soft hyperpolitics of the Obama campaign evolves into the hard hyperpolitics we know of the late 2010s and certainly the early 2020s with racial justice marches, et cetera, et cetera.
Can you give us the characteristics of the hyperpolitics and the moment of hyperpolitics? Describe for us, flesh them out. What are the characteristics of the moment of hyperpolitics and hyperpolitics in general?
I think the best way to describe it is that politics suddenly re-enters society. So questions of our collective purpose of what we do with society become very pertinent again. And everyone has to have an opinion about it. I see this with friends who were deeply anti-political in 2000s, 2010s, who are suddenly changing their profile pictures on Instagram, who suddenly have opinions about reparations, who obviously now also have very strong opinions about Russia, et cetera, et cetera. And I never saw them even vaguely interested in these questions in the 2000s and 2010s. You see it that corporations are adjusting their logos. You see it, I wouldn't call it cancel culture, but there is an aspect where what you believe politically matters enormously for your professional life as well. So that distinction between the public and the private, which was intrinsic to post-politics, is no longer around. You only need to see Jeff Bezos insist on racial justice from Amazon to say, like, wow, okay, something has definitely changed. I couldn't imagine this happening in the 1990s or 2000s in that way. And this is what I call hyperpolitics, where you have a repoliticization of so many questions, or you have a repoliticization of society, but there's no organizational correlate to it. So
you already answered this to some degree as we've gone on, but what do you think is kind of the material basis of hyperpolitics? Is it kind of just a combination of the internet and social media combined with the failures of post-politics in terms of things have continued to get worse? And what is its kind of relationship? Like, is it produced by absence? If mass politics did exist, to what would less things be political? If kind of things were more political in the sense of having mass politics, less things would be. Is that the case?
That is a perfect summary. I might even steal that phrase. But if mass politics was still around, less things would be political, because you would be able to distinguish between priorities, and there'd be a certain capacity to talk about the material bases of certain questions, which is completely impossible now. So you see it even with the recent campaign. Like, I don't think it matters that much what Disney movies feature as characters. As you say, like, it's extremely cheap. It doesn't cost any money to rename a certain street. So the classical example is they're going to never refurbish your street. It will remain decrepit, but they can rename it because, of course, it's very cheap. And if mass politics was around, we'd be discussing the question, how are we going to force people to actually refurbish a street and, for example, increase social services, rather than make sure that Disney has the right affirmative action approach to its movies.
I mean, I think this is a great example to talk about Ukraine. So obviously after the Maidan revolution in Ukraine, they took down all the Lenin statues, but kind of these decaying roads that were built by the Soviet Union have continued to decay. And now during the war, with the Russian invasion, they're promising to kind of denazify Ukraine or whatever. And obviously now the Russians are destroying the infrastructure that the Soviets built in Ukraine. And at the end, they'll put the Lenin statues back up maybe, or maybe they'll rename the roads. They'll take down Bandera Avenue that's been put up or whatever. But in the end, the roads, the infrastructure of Ukraine that's been destroyed in neoliberalization since 1992, since 2014, since the war since 2014, and the war now, that shit isn't getting fixed.
Yeah, and Ukraine is unique amongst the post-Soviet republics insofar as it actually hasn't grown since the dissolution of the Soviet bloc. Like, the economy has stagnated to a degree comparatively, even with Russia and other Eastern European satellite states, which is extremely bleak. And at the same time, as Putin said, Lenin was the inventor of Ukraine because he wanted to battle great Russian chauvinism and gave Ukraine a right to secession. But you see it is also with Putinism, and this is beyond my core area of expertise, so I'm not going to make a big pronouncement of it. But Putinism is basically a form of civilizational identity politics. We're trying to compensate for the fact that they haven't been able to deliver the material basis of consent from the Russian economy in the last 20 years. It's stable, of course, it's better than the shock therapy of the 90s, but it's not as impressive as people should be. So you have to compensate with other things, like, for example, start a war or create this idea that Russian identity is under threat, et cetera, et cetera. So again, hyperpolitics, although it's often confined to the West, and we find it very intuitive to talk about it in European and American settings, actually has components and equivalents all over the globe. And this was a striking thing when I wrote the article, that people from really different cultures reached out and said, like, I recognize this so much, even though the parameters are very different.
You know, you just gave me a twinkling in the eye or mind, if you will, so spark, when you talked about Russian politics in the context of hyperpolitics. Because when reading your article, I was envisioning hyperpolitics as a liberal to left phenomenon. Black Lives Matter, Bernie Sanders, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Just talking to you right now, I just realized, hold on. Is the rise of the reactionary right a form of hyperpolitics? Isn't, you know that global phenomenon? How do we characterize that as well?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a form of hyperpolitics insofar as it also participates in this blurring between the public-private distinction that existed in the post-political era. The two differences with the left, I think, is it's more risky. So some of the claims are actually a bit bigger. The policy terms are a bit more ambitious. But at the same time, the way the right culture wars betrays a sort of essential inability to actually organize a base. If you really want to talk about the gender of M&Ms on Fox News and think this is like a very, very prominent, important political question, I mean, great for you, but it does indicate that your agenda is extremely skewed, that you have very weird priorities if you're trying to represent these post-industrial heartlands.
Well, what I would argue, right, is that the agenda of the lords of the right, i.e. the actual capital backers of the reactionary right, and the agenda of the adherents of the right are two different things. I think that for the followers of the reactionary right, but starting maybe from the rise of Reaganism to today, or definitely for the contemporary version, the culture war stuff for them is more than catnip. They are motivated by it. And I'm talking about the masses, the proles who follow that politics, right? I think that for those that actually govern the Republican Party and the institutional actors of the reactionary right, the culture war stuff is an intentional smokescreen to keep the base stop them from challenging capital, wealth accretion upward, decimation of labor, decimation of workers, and to get them away from materialist concerns as much as possible and focus them on, it's the Mexicans are coming, culture, critical race theory, Black Lives Matter, defund the police. In other words, I think that the right has mastered using something that is much easier to see. People notice, oh my God, look at all the LGBTQ on my TV screen. What's going on? And the right will play on that. Like, defund the police. My uncle's a cop. Oh my God. And the right will play on that. In that the contested social phenomenon have always been effective tools of the reactionary right because they play on reaction. They literally play on, I'm not used to sitting next to a black kid on the bus. Why do I have to do it now? Do it now.
Yeah, I think we can make a parallel between the conflict internal to the Democratic Party, where you have a more millennial cohort that clearly lost out after the 2008 crisis, that's making redistributive demands, which are extremely uncomfortable for some of the established forces within the party. You have a variant of that on the right, insofar as real proletarian Trumpites obviously have very, very different demands and developmental visions, for example, than the established donors from the capitalist class for the Republican Party. And one way that the Republican Party tries to resolve this conflict inherent to that contradiction, because they need a peripheral working class for votes in the gerrymandered American system, but at the same time, financially, they're still dependent on these capitalists that are obviously not going to put new factories in, let's say, Michigan. But I think the big difference between the left and the right is that the benchmark, or rather the requirements on the right, are much, much lower. So if you see what Salvini of the Lega in Italy has done, is that he campaigned on a very hard anti-Euro platform and was planning on getting Italy out of the Eurozone. But when he was actually in government, or his party was in government, Italian capital, mainly in the north, revolted. His small business base in the north said, this is obviously not possible because we want good exchange rates to sell to German businesses. And he just shelved all these anti-Euro plans, just as Marine Le Pen is now shelving them at the same time. But that doesn't actually matter because the right is more comfortable with capitalist society. They don't want to shift the parameters. So the criterion of success is much lower and the electoral payoff is also not dramatic. Insofar as these parties won't lose that many votes if they fail to get Italy out of the euro. While on the left, the problem is if Syriza actually wanted to solve Greece's crisis, it would have to take massive risks. And they couldn't do that. And obviously Syriza gets punished for it while the right doesn't face the same term.
So before we move on, I want to highlight this message from chat. I don't know what the fuck it means, but he paid $50, so I'm going to read it out. Giant pear character waving flags and turning around, making the buildings in front of him tremble.
I've not read that. I wanted to read it, and I have no idea what the chat is talking about at all.
The chat made another really good point, which is that Anton is anti-M&M rights, and I think I'll have to come out for that at this point. Like, I don't. But
Russia's going to do MLM now, so clearly it's good.
No, I mean M&Ms.
M&Ms.
He has a problem with M&Ms defining their sexual orientation on commercials.
Bold statement.
Bold
statement to make.
They're making the M&Ms not sexy. It's fucked up.
Anton, you just hit something. Hit me something interesting. Marine Le Pen is pivoting to embrace the Eurozone or the EU. Is that what's hot in the streets right now in France?
I wouldn't call it embracing, but she's toned down her anti-Euro rhetoric very significantly. Part also because
is that because she's afraid of the challenge from Eric Zamora?
Partly, yeah. And I think, for example, her anti-Islam rhetoric has also mellowed a lot. And Zamora is jumping into the space that is opened up on the right, insofar as there are now a lot of established French Muslim voters who are also anti-immigration, because they came here several generations ago, and they now have a reason to vote for the Front National as well, or the Rassemblement National rather. And Marine Le Pen knows this, so she says, I want to represent the broader constituency. And that means toning down my anti-Euro rhetoric to make sure that French employers can support me too, and toning down my anti-Islam rhetoric, because immigration is a bigger issue also for Muslim voters.
It's really fascinating the way in which the reactionary right in France is splintering, but we have Eric Zamora, who is like basically a croissant eating Klansman, and we have Marine Le Pen, who is like I wouldn't say a Koch brother, but less of a croissant eating Klansman than Eric Zamora. Not to digress too much, but how do you think that's going to play out in France, by the way?
I'm not comfortable making big predictions about it. I think one conclusion we really have to take away from the current contest is the sort of radical contraction of the political spectrum that's happening in the age of hyperpolitics. France is a country where the left is now bickering about a maximum of 20% of the popular vote. So that means intra-left struggle is about 1/5 of the electorate. That's an enormously depressing conclusion. But at the same time, what's happening on the right, even if Zemmour doesn't get into the second round, even if he doesn't become president, is that the plan is to shift the entire spectrum so far to the right that the only options will be a neoliberal right wing of centrist, or the equivalent of what you could call Franco, or like Spanish fascism or integralism in France. And that means that society is hyper-politicized in France. There are massive disagreements about all these cultural issues, etc., etc. There are massive, massive debates about symbolic issues. But in the background, there is a great moving right show, as Stuart Hall called it, which is decimating the left. Like, it's very depressing to see.
While we're on it, do you want to talk about the Workers' Party in Belgium and their recent successes and how this fits into this framework?
That's a great question. I could talk about it for a long time. I'm obviously a bit biased because I have friends and I know people within the party. But I think what explains their success formula of how have they held up comparatively.
Can we mention to the chat who they are? And like the
so they're called the PTB, Parti Travail Belge, the PvdA on the Flemish side. They're the last unitary party of Belgium. So unlike all the other parties, they haven't split into a Walloon, into a Flemish contingent. But what makes them particularly powerful, even though they started at this left-wing sect in the 1970s, basically sort of post-68 Maoist party, is that Belgium still has a very densely organized and big union movement. So more than 50% of the workforce is unionized. This also partly has to do with the setup of the Belgian social security system, in which unions actually manage a part of the budget for social services, which obviously turns them into service unions in an explicit but also good sense, that workers just naturally join unions as a reflex because it's much easier. And employers also prefer to negotiate with unions instead of having these messy work disputes. But at the same time, normally these unions were tied to traditional political parties. With the decline of these traditional political parties, the unions have basically alienated from them. That holds for the Christian Union, that also holds for the Socialist Union. What the PTB has been able to do very successfully is that they've jumped into this representative void and become the spokesperson for a fatherless or an orphan union movement that still has massive infrastructural sense. And I think comparatively, this explains why the PTB is successful, is that they actually have a base in civil society and they're not just a digital party. They're not just a Twitter machine, although they're present online, of course, but they have a connection to a base that is not just purely based on followers and tweets, etc., etc.
And if I wondered too, if like even the where the connection to the base is actually what is important, because as you're describing their role, not only as like labor like labor disputes and getting, you know, better wages, better conditions, X, Y, and Z, but an actual function in society as far as delivering services that people need, like throughout their life, and also too is like I mean, really a sense of like just political legitimacy. You know, we could trust that these people will act in our interests because they do it every day.
Yes, and I think the relationship to your base is very different from these more digital parties, insofar as digital parties can whip up a lot of support for very local, or I almost say transitory causes, whether it's a protest action against something, whether it's doing a petition, but they can't actually marshal a base in the sense that they can discipline their members. This is what's so striking about Trumpism, but it also holds for left populist parties, is that they can have these massive surges of electoral or popular support, but they don't know who's in and outside of the party. And with Momentum, or even with Mélenchon in France, this is even more explicit insofar as they call it a gas-like, or a sort of parti gazeux, that the party doesn't really have an inside and an outside. Non-members and members are very hard to distinguish from each other. Well, with the PTB, there's a very clear distinction between members and non-members. The members are trained as militants, they get a specific intellectual education, etc. While at the same time, unions also have this very concrete material relationship where they have to deliver to their members, because otherwise the members won't actually join them. And at the same time, that also means that they can ask things of their members that, for example, a digital party or an NGO an NGO doesn't have an actual popular base, can't actually ask.
Well, one of the things that I found interesting in your article is you have some statistical data that demonstrates how left parties in Europe, generally in the world, have been on the decline, except for in Britain with the rise of Jeremy Corbyn, and how unfortunately that ended up being kind of a catastrophe. Do you think that this is a harbinger of a global right-wing reactionary pivot that will become basically the dominant force in the West? I've made the argument that I foresee the United States is going to become, like Great Britain, a one-party right-wing state.
I think Adolf Reed prediction that it might even be scarier in the US is partly right. So you don't have to be an MSNBC, liberal, to see that what the Republican Party is intent on doing is extremely dangerous. And you have a political party which is not even interested in bourgeois democracy, which feels very comfortable suspending it. At the same time, what you see in Britain is indeed a one-party state, or at least a party that's been in government for so long that, again, it doesn't have any disciplinary opposition. So Boris Johnson can have gaffe after gaffe and failure after failure. He won't actually deliver to the northern voters who recently went from Labour to the Conservatives, but precisely because he faces no real opposition. There's not really an issue to it. And I wouldn't call it the arrival of a sort of continuous reactionary hegemony. If you look at the European political map now, actually, like, liberal parties, certainly in Germany, are in power. So the right-wing wave hasn't materialized to that extent. It's just that the space in which the left fights is becoming smaller and smaller. And I think France is a harbinger of that. Italy is, of course, a nightmare scenario insofar as they haven't had a left for more than 30 years almost, or at least since the 2000s. And that is a scary scenario where it's not that there's a reactionary hegemony, it's just that you have politics without a left. And we don't really know what that looks like because we don't have precedent.
It's really amazing. You are the first guest we've had that has actually made the argument that not only is the left weak in the United States, but it's almost non-existent anywhere in the world right now. It's basically dying.
I mean, there's a question whether it's non-existent intellectually. So I think after 2008, with the existence of the left media sphere, there are certain conversations that became possible that were completely unimaginable in the 2000s. The question is, organizationally, what does the left represent now, except an aggregate of certain scenes? And there, the question becomes much more difficult. Because Corbynism was this big leap over the institutions, as they called it, insofar as they captured the party and they were able to actually do very impressive in one election. But in the long term, what did Corbynism leave behind? And it left behind a radicalized generation that had much clearer idea of what was wrong with capitalism than anyone in the Blair years. But it's not like it built any durable institutions. And of course, you can't just blame it for them. Like, you're acting in a heavily constrained environment. But there has to be a sober assessment of what left populism actually left behind.
Marcus, you want to jump in?
I mean, I wholly agree with what Anton was just saying, and like, and this is like the thing that's tough too is like, and I think you make a good point of it's important to look at where we're at and how we got here, and I think that's why you're here, right? Is that the framing of post-politics into hyper-politics is giving a good understanding of why things look so insane, because
they do.
It's like something where, hey, this is something that was organized into something. It's like it seems like a lighting off of a fireworks, right? It's like a box, but then once that the wick goes, it just shoots, and you don't know where these things are going to end up. And so I guess where does this leave with us, even like the predictability of some of like these quote unquote post-political movements that are now been like hyper, or just but hyperized, like I don't even know how to say it. Hyped up,
hyped up is a great way of saying it.
In our normal day conversations, and to the point where where you feel on climate change will lead to how you feel on abortion, on work.
Oh, Marcus, you mute yourself.
Marcus, you muted yourself.
Sorry, but you do. Sorry, but like you do, all these things come together. But I think I hit the space bar actually. But whatever hashtag or Netflix show that you watch that's associated with these things does absolutely nothing to solve any of these problems. I guess where does that leave us to actually try and get into some better spheres?
I think there's one danger which I've detected with certain friends who are just so exhausted with this hyper-political environment that they almost develop a nostalgia for post-politics. It's like, if only people could become apathetic and indifferent again, and then I wouldn't have
to not care about the M&Ms and not care about anything else.
Yeah, I don't want to hear my cousin at a family gathering talk about how they posted a black square during the BLM protests, etc., even though he never even mentioned any interest in these questions. I think that's not the right instinct. I think the question is, clearly you can't ban politics from society forever. Like, clearly it has to reimpose itself at one point, certainly when you have economic dislocation on the scale of 2008. The question just becomes, there are loads of well-meaning, morally pure people around who are very worried and very sad about what's happening with the world. But the task of the left, or what goes for the left, should be to explain to these people that having these moral intentions doesn't actually amount to anything in politics yet. Your intentions are just intentions or ambitions. And politics is an organizational business where you have to be serious about power. And this is at least what was good about left populism, is that it seemed as if the left was actually serious or interested in power again. And now we're in a situation where even that question is not being asked anymore, but at least the memory should be kept alive.
Well, I think that one of the phenomena that produces the conundrum you're showing us here, Anton, is that what hyperpolitics is filled with is non-materialist based politics. It's profoundly identitarian. It's profoundly based in feelings. It's a kind of an emo politics, if you will. And part of the problem that I have with those of us who consider ourselves leftists or on the left or dialectical materialists or various iterations of Marxist, socialists, anti-capitalists, or whatever, is that we have failed in explaining the material nature of the moment that we are in, while everyone is recognizing capitalism is in crisis.
Yes, and you're absolutely right that symbolism is not just an intellectual mistake. It's not just as if the left makes these mistakes in a purely contingent way. There is something almost gravitational about the focus on identity and on symbolic issues, because that's how our public sphere is structured. So you just need to look at the American culture wars. This is not just an aberration. It expresses something essential about how political debate works today. So questions of who you are become more prominent over questions of what you own or what you actually believe in, precisely because the media climate has its own internal logic. And I think Twitter is the best, or at least the entire internet is the best example of this. Even though people try to do serious things on there, myself included, it's just constitutively built in such a way that you can't actually have productive debates in that way. And Facebook and the rest of social media is also algorithmically set up in a way to generate profit. We know that now, it's been made very explicit. So that means any content you see will be determined by that profit motive. And that means you have a public sphere which is constitutively built against real debate. So of course they have to conjure up a whole fake news panic, and they have to say there's misinformation, because they don't want to talk about the fact of how these platforms are set up for profit and thereby produce deeply perverted political debates about the gender identity of M&Ms, for example.
Do you take it that hyperpolitics is something that's going to last for a while? So mass politics lasted maybe 150 years, post-politics maybe 30 years, but hyperpolitics in its kind of hyperness feels like something that has to be like an interregnum. Like, we're not going to go back to mass politics, presumably, but I don't believe that we'll, keep going through like internet hype into ephemeral movement, into internet hype into ephemeral movement.
How fast is this thing going to burn out? And is it going to explode at the end or not?
So I was wondering, for instance, like the Starbucks unionization in the United States, where it's spread via online hype, which is filtering through a politicized generation, but then is going into actual organization. Is that the kind of thing, if we're optimistic, that we're looking forward to? Or will this be just kind of like an ephemeral thing again?
I think someone like Sam Chris, in reviewing the book by the Alfred Bunga Bunga Boys, the podcast, made this point that there's going to be an end of the end of the end of history. So triple negation. And so far as he said, this thing is not going to last and it's going to blow off, just like a depressive patient who jumps out of a manic phase will inevitably revert back to depression. And then there was this piece on the vibe shift, which is coming, is that there's now a generation of TikTok Zoomers who really don't care about all this online political posturing and who will be as anti-political as the grungers of the 1990s. I think those are plausible hypotheses, but at the same time, again, I want to say that it's like post-politics just can't last that long, because there are certain questions which you inevitably have to answer as a society, which you can't delegate to the market or to technocrats. markets. So even if hyperpolitics evolves into something different, and even if mass politics is never coming back, or isn't likely to come back anytime soon, there has to be a way of mediating these questions. And hyperpolitics is one expression of it. It might evolve into something more stable, but I don't think we're ever going back to this sort of nostalgic post-history of the 2000s where people long back for what is it, like the Olympics or the Obama election as a pristine, innocent time before everything went down the drain in 2016 or whatever.
I don't think capitalism is going to allow us to do that anyway, right? I think that this central banking financed economy that we see globally is already post-COVID is already showing its fractures, combined with the situation with the energy prices that's going to be coming out of this Ukraine crisis. That inflationary realities are going to have to cause some kind of reaction by the Fed and the central banks. And if they raise interest rates enough times, if they stop this quantitative easing, it's going to be a crash, one way or the other. There's definitely going to be a crash. It's just a matter of how big and how deep it's going to be.
Yeah, this is a very important point. The material preconditions for post-politics is also a stable growth regime. So the sort of privatized...
Say it again.
Yeah, so if you buy, you have to buy consent in a certain way through this privatized Keynesianism, which we knew from the 1990s and 2000s, where cheap credit was abundantly available. That you can't maintain that forever. Now, with this sort of central bank capitalism we know today, or even something with the climate crisis, you can't defer and delay these questions forever. At one point, there has to be conflict of interest that's assumed, and you have to make decisions. And if capitalism can't deliver that stability, politics will still be there because the question will impose itself in some way. It's just sad that the only way it can impose itself is through this stupidly hyper-political lens. And I think the Starbucks example, which Stefan gave, is a hopeful example where it's not like everything is impossible. And at least what's interesting about Corbynism is that it did show an appetite for radical politics, not only in one generational cohort, but across certain social groups, which the left should be hopeful for. Just as Bernie showed that there's a terrain or there's a cartography out there, which proves that people are still interested in the things that the left forstood historically. It's just that we don't actually have the means to enforce them.
Listen, I'm not going to let the Bernie phenomenon off that easy. That was a massively squandered opportunity, man.
Yeah, but it was an opportunity. For there to be an opportunity, there has to be something, right? It wasn't nothing.
No, I agree with you. I disagree with some of the guests we've had that Jason and I have interviewed that kind of poo-pooed the Bernie phenomenon. I was like, oh, it was horrible for the left. I was like, come on.
What?
It was one of the, well, I'm not going to name names, but it caused a massive expansion of people's interest in materialist politics. I mean, listen, I'm old enough to remember when no one was talking about being a socialist.
In 2015, the American left was you, Jason, and whoever you were talking to.
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much, literally. So the overall ideological effect of Sanders' campaign was very significant. And my position is not that it was not significant. My position is that the failed opportunity to organize a proletariat and a mass politics to combat the central forces of lethargy is what really, really disappoints, if not angers me, about those who were in the Bernie members of the Bernie phenomenon, who are active in the Bernie phenomenon. It was such a profoundly wasted opportunity. I will give it a pass. I can understand how Trumpism shocked everyone. They were like, "Oh my God, we have to fight Trump," blah blah blah. But in 2020, after 2020, the whole Bernie apparatus should have been mobilized to put pressure on Biden on every single issue.
And that's like the thing, though, is that with you got the structure of the campaign, which was not ideologically similar, and that is what I think gets to when the thing ends. This was like a team assembled by Bernie Sanders and some of these people that some of them were socialists, some of them were democratic socialists, some of them are just run-of-the-mill Democrats, some of them were just organizers that eventually wanted to, sell some books. And it went to the winds, but where on the ground, as far as the mass movement, that's, I think, part of the reason why there was no organizational idea to turn this over, and there was absolutely, and
Marcus,
it all goes away.
You're making excuses. There was no movement because they didn't want one to be.
I thought I just said that.
I think
there was zero goal for them to do anything after the campaign, because none of the organization was even geared towards that.
So you don't have to absolve anyone of blame they deserve, for example, not galvanizing the Bernie legacy into something more concrete. At the same time, I think there needs to be a structural awareness of the alternatives to party organization, or even to organization as such today. If you live in a world where there's abundant cheap credit and you can just organize a simulacrum or simulation of a civil society online, the exit opportunities are massive. There's loads of ways of getting your political voice heard or of living a stable life in capitalist democracies nowadays, which don't involve really strong organizational costs. And people are just presented with a risk calculus, as they do with unions, that either you do this and it might pay off, but it's extremely risky. And if you lose, you might even lose everything that allows you to lead that stable life. Or you just stick with these easier, cheaper options for making your voice heard, whether it's through acquiring cheap credit or just rage posting online. And it's not surprising that a lot of people choose this option. What the left has to do is present a risk calculus which is convincing and say that you have to take this risk. It's a good idea and your life will get much better because of it.
If we could, just add a question back to on HyperPolitics, but how capital is seizing on HyperPolitics, and i.e. private school industry seizing on critical race theory, situations like that where they can tie into some of these things, but it's not really something where this, even the hype around critical race theory is not necessarily it was just some random YouTube right-wing YouTuber that has no tie to these school things, but they find a way of shepherding it to the point where, oh hey, now the school voucher programs and everything like that. So I don't know if you can, if there's any, the length of which capital can
I think
benefits from.
Yeah, I think we need to follow Adolf Reed on this, who rightly says race politics is a class politics. It's just not as visible, in that even this hyperpolitics, even though superficially and outwardly it looks as if it's exclusively concerned with symbolic or non-material issues, there is a material side to it, insofar as, for example, quota or demands for certain actors to be removed from movies opens up job opportunities for the people making these claims. So it is a substitute for collective bargaining. I'm really strongly convinced that variants of what they call cancel culture is actually just a substitute for collective bargaining in a country where you can't actually organize. So how will you maximize your capacity on a labor market is not by joining a collective organization, but by making sure that your competitors on that labor market are eliminated because of these hyper-political criteria. And in that sense, hyperpolitics has a patronage, or a clientelistic aspect to it, where a certain section of the middle class that has immiserated in the last 10 years is able to get material benefits out of some hyperpolitical moments.
Stefan, you have any points you want to make?
I was going to ask, we've obviously talked about it a few times throughout the thing, but what do you think is the relationship between hyperpolitics and this kind of unprecedented reaction by, and I'm doing very big scare quotes here, civil society to the war in Ukraine? When Russian-bred cats are being banned from international competition, is this hyperpolitics? Is this a reaction to hyperpolitics?
I mean, before 1914, when you had a specific form of nationalism in which German books were banned in Britain after the invasion, there are precedents for this. So this is not unique. I do think there's something specific about the situation now, is that you have Sainsbury's, which is a supermarket in the UK, which removed or changed the name of Chicken Kiev in their stores, for example. Is that the costs? Yeah, this is showing support. And that means that the costs of a certain civil society, as you said, mobilization have radically been lowered because of the internet. And with the escalation of the sanctions talk in the last week, you can see that you can now whip up certain politicians into a frenzy, get them to make extremely drastic decisions, basically shut down one of the biggest economies or biggest landmass on the world, purely because the internet allows these very direct channels to political agents. And this means that hyperpolitics can have hugely destabilizing events insofar as if politicians are constantly at the mercy of these online flash mobs. That also means they don't have a certain coolness or I'd say distance toward policy questions, which is sometimes required. That's not an argument against democratic interference in foreign policy, for example, but it does mean if you can just organize campaigns so cheaply because of the internet, that creates very volatile elite mass relationships. Because in these previous traditional right-wing parties, there was an elite and there was a base and there was mediation between the two. And that means that the base can discipline the top and the top can also discipline the base. But now that mediation completely disappears and there's just complete direct interaction, extremely fast and quick. And as we saw with Ukraine, you can basically incite certain politicians to shut down and turn an economy into a siege economy overnight. And that's crazy development.
So do you think that social media is really one of the vehicles that makes hyperpolitics a phenomenon?
I think it's not equivalent to it. So hyperpolitics exists without social media. No, I'd describe it differently. I wouldn't say that social media can be equated with hyperpolitics, but I think hyperpolitics is unimaginable with social media because social media offers this new political form or this new tool of mobilization that is extremely cheap, has its particular internal dynamics, which make a form of politicization possible that's completely different from what we saw in the 20th century.
And well, I have a question too, like even just like about what's the invasion of Ukraine and some of these stories that have come out and like just the role where like war propaganda is now overlapping.
Very, very interesting one with that. There's obviously kind of Ukrainian propaganda produced by Ukrainians, and there's kind of Ukrainian propaganda produced for Westerners, but there's also Ukraine war propaganda produced by Westerners for Westerners. Like if you saw the Ghost of Kiev thing, the Ghost of Kiev thing was invented by a Scottish YouTuber and then propagated not in Ukraine, but in the West. It was like a West to West invention, which had no relationship at all to anything which actually happened in Ukraine.
And when you have
avoiding all of this nonsense as much as possible.
Yeah, if you have a massively demobilized society, which for example, Putinite Russia is as well, like it is a Bonapartist regime which relies on demobilization. It basically has to neuter any form of political opposition, but therefore it has to neuter any form of political mobilization. But what you have is a demobilized society that can easily create a semblance of mobilization online. So before you had to actually set up a campaign, you had to get a newspaper, you had to get representatives. There were all these organizational requirements, even to, I'd say, war agitation. Well, now you can just log on and it's done. You're ready. Like you can start quote tweeting Biden and trying to institute or get
nuclear war now.
Yeah. Like there are loads of people in like middle class apartments in London who are calling for no-fly zones, so basically nuclear war directly from their living room.
Absurd. Stefan, you have anything you want to jump in with?
No, I just want to eat my pizza.
Yeah, I'm getting pretty hungry too.
Well, listen, we've gone for an hour and a half. We usually go with an hour and a half and 2 hours, but I think that we have done a very effective job at positing your thesis here, Anton, and I really enjoyed this discussion. We covered a lot of bases, and it was profoundly educational, comrade. And I'm wondering, would you be willing to come on again?
I'd love to, and we definitely have to talk about populism, but I just want to say that these were the best questions I've ever had on the topic as such, and you've actually convinced me that there's something to the thesis, or at least that.
Good.
Oh, wow. I hope all of us are, but I'm definitely very honored. I was very impressed by your writing and your presentation on this show. I'm going to be very honest with you. We've interviewed quite a few people. You're one of the best guests we've ever had. Your succinct capacity to really break down political phenomenon in the American and global context is beyond impressive, brother. I mean, I look forward to when you get your first book out. I would love to hear you. I mean, I think that, we've been fortunate to tap into a potentially young, bright, shining star in left intellectual scholarship and writing. And I really hopefully that what we're seeing here produces something that takes you in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very happy with that description of me as an influencer. Like, I'm like a hyper-political.
It's funny, I haven't spoken to Anton like voice to voice in ages, and because we were kind of late starting, I didn't even say hello.
No, yes, hello, Stefan. I mean, we've been exchanging some spicy tweets. That's the only thing we've been doing.
Well, yeah, I think what's really important though about like what you've written is like giving clarity to how insane like the world looks, and especially if you're viewing it through Twitter or Facebook or any of these things, like giving an understanding of just the landscape is I think one of the more useful things to know where you're going. And as the left, we've got a long way to go, and we can't do it without brilliant people like you. So I appreciate it. Yeah. So.
Yeah, no, and it's just your questions were excellent, particularly yours, Pascal. Thanks for engaging with it so thoroughly. And it shows that once you actually impose a material lens on a very puzzling question, you can still make sense of it. It's the immortal power of the dialectic. Absolutely.
No, excellent, Anton. We're going to have you on again, brother. I really appreciate the conversation. Next time, we're going to talk about the U.S. populist era of the late 19th century.
I'd love to. I'm already looking forward to it.
Pascal, do you want to read out the super chat? They probably like it.
Yes, thank you, Landrew. Shout out to Landrew for the consistently generous super chats. Thank you. Great episode, TIR. Always a learning experience. Landrew, thank you for your dedication and support of our show.
Thanks again, guys.
No problem.
So bye-bye.
Well, on that note, we would like to thank our guest, Anton Jäger. Anton, where can our followers find your work and find you?
Unfortunately, I'll have to plug my Twitter page here. It'll be on.
It has more followers than any of us, so.
Yeah, I'm not proud of it. I didn't want to declare it, but I can just give you my Twitter handle and most of the right.
Yeah, what is your Twitter, please?
It's Anton, Anton Jagermm. So Anton Jäger with A-E-M-M, double M at the end.
Excellent. Anton Jäger, M.M. So we can follow you there. Are you regularly going to be writing in Jacobin?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to not get myself commissioned too much because I do have to teach and I have some academic duties, but inevitably I think I'll get sucked into it.
Okay. Excellent. Well, on that note, comrades, thank you very much for showing up for our free show today. And Stefan, you're going to have the final hammer, but we are out.